This is Jim Fetzer in Madison, Wisconsin, where I'm very pleased today to be joined by Carl Herman from San Ramon, California, and Chris Weinert in Detroit, Michigan. We're here to bring you all the news you need to know. Some of which is rather significant. We begin with the House Democrats threatening to trash the Constitution to ensure the conviction of Trump. Jonathan Turley gives a very thoughtful analysis where presidents have historically not testified, and yet the House impeachment manager, Jamie Riskin, has threatened that if Trump doesn't show up, it will be used against him. He wrote in a letter to Trump, "If you decline this invitation, we reserve any and all rights, including the right to establish at trial that your refusal to testify supports a strong adverse inference regarding your actions or inaction on January 6th, but that's completely ridiculous." According to Turley, Raskin's statement implies Trump needs to testify or his silence is evidence of guilt, where under this theory, any response other than conceding the allegations would trigger this response and allow the House to use the silence of the accused as an inference of guilt, which conflicts with one of the most precious and revered principles in American law, to wit, a refusal to testify should not be used against an accused party. The scholar, Turley, who actually offered testimony during the first impeachment inquiry, noted that the Fifth Amendment declares no person shall be compelled in any criminal case to be a witness against himself. It's true that this is not a criminal trial. It is a constitutional trial. As such, the Senate should try and accuse according to our highest traditions and values. That includes respecting the right to remain silent and not have an inference drawn from the fact that Trump will not be present or give testimony. We also have the oddity that at the same time, BLM and Antifa are marching through Washington, D.C., actually bringing about far more atrocious behavior than any that Trump might have allegedly instigated by telling his followers to peacefully and patriotically express their opposition to the theft of the election. Black Lives Matter and Antifa protesters marched in the streets of Washington, D.C., scuffling with police officers threatening to burn down the nation's capital. On Saturday, members of BLM and Antifa protested where they regularly chanted, "If we don't get it, burn it down. If we don't get it, burn it down." During the FTP march, which is an acronym for F the police, the mob shouted the anti-police battle cry, ACAB, all cops are bastards. Unbelievable. They stopped near a row of restaurants, delivering lectures about race, Black, and Indigenous lives to nearby diners. You're not going to hear a word of complaint about that from the Democrat leadership of the House or the Senate, though, are we, Carl? How outrageous. Your thoughts?
I think it's great because the more they do, the more corrupt they are. So Jonathan Turley, he has argued cases in front of the Supreme Court. He had the top rated law blog, and I follow his work with appreciation. So, the Fifth Amendment, he's absolutely right. So the Fifth Amendment says is that you do not have to provide any help at all to somebody who is accusing you of doing something wrong. The burden of proof is entirely on them. So that statement from whatever shill that is from the one-party system is an absolute lie and contradicts everything that all American school children are taught in school and was guaranteed by the founders as a natural right. So it's just ridiculous behavior. And then, as we discussed previously on shows, the word incitement and the word insurrection have meanings that aren't anywhere near close that you could say that those happened. And in addition to that, the House, they didn't allow any testimony or evidence at that time. They just went ahead to vote to impeach him, not caring about allowing the other side. So this is just the most vile BS to push a political agenda. And in this case, it is the one-party state, jumping to the next article, that explicitly uses threats of violence and actually arson, murder, destruction, fencing off areas, destroying businesses. Now, those are real crimes. So, while one, I like the idea of letting them paint themselves as more and more ridiculous, two, I mean, at some point, the white hats, if they exist, are going to have to call this show. And perhaps it'll be the trial in the Senate that they're going to lay out the evidence that includes many of the leaders on the left side actually promising and inciting violence. That will be part of the president's team's defense.
I feel strongly this whole impeachment thing is going to backfire massively on the Democrats. Chris, your thoughts?
Well, I've kind of expressed them before, saying that this is a two-party theater that's put on to lower the status quo. And I think it's almost like this ham-fisted overreach should come around and slap the DNC straight in the face and probably expose much of the corruption within their ranks, as well as the hypocrisies and inversions of policies and things like that. So I'm not surprised. I think they're really just trying to do this to see how much they get away with. And I don't understand why Trump is waiting, so long to just drop the hammer on these guys if he is in fact going to do so, because his whole term, he's been pretty much on the ropes and on eggshells from these people over absurdities and non-existent issues that they're pretty much sensationalizing and magnifying, while pretty much ignoring the real issues, I think, in Donald Trump that they should be going after him for. But, that's maybe a different story in itself. But I almost think that this martyr effect is kind of useful to like not only callous the Trump base, but to solidify and maybe even strengthen it with people that are maybe not involved with this two-party, theater, or this, whatever you call it. So I'm still trying to figure out what the grounds are for this second impeachment and why it is that Congress acts so fast into doing this while the American people are literally getting broomed out of their homes and out of their jobs as non-essential workers and literally just being run out of town. So I'm baffled by this. I'm baffled by supposedly how the BLM and Antifa and FBI and even the involvement with like the Proud Boys or the historic involvement with like COINTELPRO or JTTF. I'm really shocked at how somehow or another, like the media and the politicians never point this out, and how the people never really seem to realize the FBI is nothing more than a banker's Gestapo. And I don't think they're anything, they've never been anything but that, I should say. So I think at some point in time, the DNC, the United Nations, and Israel are probably going to suffer for this ham-fisted attempt to do what they're doing. And hopefully it will be sooner than later, because if there are white hats going to sort this out, I think I don't know how much longer this could go on without it being an absolute demoralization of what's left of their spirit.
And there are more and more reports of the FBI having evidence that was all pre-planned, even planned on the internet. And of course, that means that what Trump had to say or didn't say had nothing to do with what happened at the Capitol, which was clearly a coordinated event. If you want the mastermind, it's very obvious it's Nancy Pelosi, who then went forward with this absurd and unconstitutional impeachment on multiple grounds, which cannot possibly have any legal significance. Meanwhile, in support of Marjorie Taylor Greene, the AP laid out a series of charges against her, which I have systematically debunked. Democrats are so scared of Marjorie Taylor Greene, they've taken the unprecedented step of stripping her of her committee assignments, the first time the majority party in the House has interfered with the minority party's rights and privileges, which reinforces the point that they are the undemocratic party, better renamed the party of despotism. She's so fearless and outspoken, she's already laid out the case for Joe Biden's impeachment. The AP has documented a few of her positions, but not on either Sandy Hook or the Parkland school shootings, no doubt because they're afraid of encouraging the public to take a closer look. Both were stage events where nobody died. For those in doubt, check out these on Sandy Hook and on Parkland. Here I offer additional sources substantiating her take on those they do cite, including she expressed skepticism about Las Vegas, where we have established Las Vegas was a movie with a pre-recorded soundtrack of machine gun fire coordinated special effects of light flashing on the fourth floor of the Mandalay Bay Hotel when the sheriff insists there's no evidence of any shots having been fired other than the 32nd floor of the West Wing. Mona Alexis Presley has discovered obituaries were based on persons who died in different states or on different dates or from different causes of death. She even found the LVPD crime map for the square mile around the concert area, which shows minor infractions, burglary, assault, and battery and such, but no shooting incidents. And the local hospitals confirmed no shooting victims were admitted following the incident, which one referred to as having been a drill. The AP does no research and doesn't know the difference between fantasy and reality. She also suggested lasers were used out in California for the fire. There appears to be no alternative explanation for the destruction of the homes reduced to cinder ash, while the surrounding trees and shrubbery are virtually completely unaffected. They do not appear to be natural, but to be man-made, where the use of lasers would explain the phenomena. MTG is hardly the only person to suspect the use of directed energy laser devices, but that's the impression the AP wants to convey as a form of special pleading, fallacy of only citing evidence favorable to your side. Also, she's called out Imran Oman, where they give a completely exaggerated version of what she had to say about Oman, which is an example of the position known as a straw man to make it easier to attack. MTG has been pointed in taking on members of the squad and savaging Ilhan Omar for having married her brother, only one among their many outrageous acts. Not only has Omar committed far more serious offenses than any by MTG, she claims MTG committed incitement of insurrection, which is the same charge lodged against Donald Trump for his second impeachment, which experts have observed have no basis on either count, since incitement must be specific and with intent, and there was no attempt by anyone to overthrow the American government. Meanwhile, she's also made very strong observation about Hillary Clinton and Huma Abedin in sexually assaulting and actually murdering a young girl. The videos on Anthony Weiner's laptop, which James Comey suppressed in relation to the 2016 election, just as Christopher Wray did to the Hunter Biden laptop for the 2020, are so horrific that I have hesitated to say publicly what the AP has published here, but which appears to be accurate, as I have documented in my Pizzagate, Real or Fiction, the American franchise of Pedogate. This does not appear to be disinformation, but gruesome fact. WikiLeaks revelations have included that Barack Obama spent $65,000 flying pizza and hot dogs from Chicago to the White House for a private party. What you need to know is that the White House does not accept food from outside sources to circumvent the prospect of food poisoning, that actual hot dogs and pizza flown from Chicago would be soggy and inedible. And in the language of pedophilia, hot dog stands for little boy and pizza for little girls. Meanwhile, she's also suggested Nancy Pelosi is a traitor. Well, most Americans are aware Nancy Pelosi tore up Trump's State of the Union speech after it was broadcast live on television. And most Americans are aware that the deep state would like to remove him by any means necessary, just as JFK was taken out of Dallas on 22 November 1963 by assassination, where circumstantial evidence published in the Duran implicates Nancy Pelosi at the State of the Union. A lip reader discovered that members of the House and Senate were discussing life after Trump in knowledge of a plot to assassinate the president by Nancy Pelosi using a poison patch on her hand, which she extended in an odd way so Trump would not notice. But he had been tipped off and refused to shake her hand. The situation was so serious, a bad lip reading diversion was created and published. Then she also observed no plane had hit the Pentagon. Even Jamie McIntyre, CNN's best correspondent on the scene at the Pentagon that day, corrected his anchor by pointing out that, from my close-up inspection, there's no evidence of a plane having crashed anywhere near the Pentagon, which tells us that the AP does no more research than politicians who have long since been co-opted by Israel and the deep state. She has been calling out. Notice even the photo the AP included here does not show any debris from a plane having hit the Pentagon. Indeed, all four of the 9/11 crash sites were fake, albeit in different ways, which I even confirmed with Major General Albert Stubblebine, U.S. Army retired, who was formerly in charge of all U.S. military signals intelligence and who therefore also stands in agreement with Marjorie Taylor Greene. Carl, your thoughts?
Well, for Congresswoman Greene, she's either on her own or she is doing some disclosure work. But at any event, what she did was just a skirmishing attack because then she retreated. In her, I don't know what even to call it, an apology speech in front of the House before she was unprecedentedly stripped from any work on committees, she backed down instead of doubling down. I thought it would be great if she would go ahead and double down, because that great article that you provided, Jim, yes, indeedy, those allegations are in fact provable conspiracies and crimes and lies of our own government. And those crimes have to be called treason. When you assassinate a US president with President Kennedy and then his brother, who would have been president just 6 months later, and Dr. King, so these people are as evil or beyond the evil that you can imagine. So, but as we go along, it is just more political theater, as Chris talks about. And I did want to point out that what Chris says about the FBI and the government enforcement agencies, you really need to see that to the extent that you've been propagandized by good-looking actors on television shows representing those agencies to steal your trust, when the actual facts of the case go no further than the assassinations of the Kennedys and Dr. King to see who they really are.
Nice points. Yeah, Chris, yours.
Yeah, right on the money, Carl. I agree with you there. Yeah, they've had not only a role in bungling these cases, but in many cases covering up a lot of this stuff and even running these domestic terror operations as a loophole for the CIA's charter. So I think that it's important to point out the historic instances in which they've done this, and there's too many to cite. But I mean, this goes back to even before there was even technically an FBI under Wilson with the Jim Crow stuff, and you know, the robber barons doing this to disrupt labor and to really fuel the anarchist movement, or to make it radical, and then to bring an FBI in to go after any sort of domestic dissent to his absurd policies like World War I or the Federal Reserve or income tax laws or even the League of Nations. So yeah, I think you're seeing big money running these puppets like Wilson, just like you are with Pelosi and the Getty family, probably running her, or Newsom or Kamala Harris or any of these people. So I think also kind of what's going on with the Marjorie Taylor Greene is maybe she's getting run through what I think is a humiliation ritual from like the Masonic orders, where they often make somebody backtrack and really eat crow, no pun intended. But this apology tour and even pulling her off the committees, I can see why they got to get her off the budget committee. That makes perfect sense. But I mean, like the public targeting from the mainstream media is certainly a coordinated action, we'll just say. So I think that it's no coincidence. I don't think it's a happenstance event. I think that, you know, you're getting the scumbag alliance going after anybody that could be possible dissenters or populist leaders. And I think she's a great populist leader from the bulk of things she's exposed, and standing up for the truth in things like Sandy Hook or Vegas or Parkland, you know, or Boston, 9/11, some of these things, you know. So it's kind of funny, the people that are arguably complicit with these things, or at least covering it up, are going after people that are questioning them and asking them to be considered traitors. So I think that really the treason needs to be, I guess, given a second thought, because if you listen to these guys with the loudest microphones, you know they're inverting just about every sense of common sense or reality, or and this inversion's got to get called out. It can't just keep going on. And it almost seems like there's a two-party attack where the mainstream media and the moneyed interest is going after each party with a specific set of information and half-truths and triggering them, you know. So it's, you know, AOC's enemy list. How does that go on when they're saying unity and stuff like this? I mean, this is just such a hypocrisy. It's like punching someone in the face and saying, I'm seeking peace, you know. So I mean, it's bullshit. And if you don't call it out for bullshit, you're really just going to be, you know, basically inverted or weaponized by it. against your best interest. So I think it's good to have a line in the sand in terms of perception and reality and truth. So yeah, I think a big part of this drama is to infantilize and to make it emotional and to draw in these limbic reactions as they usually do. And if anybody was trying to overthrow the government, I'd arguably say it was the DNC who's done it twice in the past two elections, in 2016 within their own party and then here in the national in 2020. So yeah, I'm kind of looking at the war on common sense and kind of standing here and thinking the truth will be the first casualty of war unless we really stand up for it.
Nice. Very nice. Very nice. I'm still a huge fan. Meanwhile, and this may be one of the most important blogs I ever authored, conspiracy theorists are investigating crimes. No wonder they want to silence us. The CIA's denigration of citizen investigation may be the greatest psyop in American history. When you stop to think about it, why should anyone be opposed to new research on the assassination of JFK, the atrocities of 9/11, the death of Senator Paul Wellstone, or the shooting at Sandy Hook Elementary School? After all, if the official narratives we have been given by the local, state, and federal authorities were true, then those who are doing research are simply spinning their wheels in a pointless endeavor because the truth is already known. So if those who are doing this research are being subjected to one attack after another, think of Jim Garrison, New Orleans DA, who wanted to establish the who, the how, and the why of the death of JFK, but was even lampooned by Johnny Carson on the Tonight Show. You have to ask why. He was getting too close to the truth, so they used Johnny to shut him down. Egad, every American was glued to their television set the weekend of 22 to 24 November 1963, where the networks were reporting in real time the results of examinations of the body at Parkland Hospital, which included that the president had been hit by a small, clean puncture wound to his throat, which Malcolm Perry, MD, described 3 times as a wound of entry during the Parkland press conference. The bullet was coming at him. And subsequently, it was a simple matter of a bullet right through the head, as Malcolm Kilduff, acting press secretary, announced at 1 p.m. Central Time, and where the bullet entered his right temple and exited the back of his head, a finding attributed to Admiral George Berkeley, who was JFK's personal physician, and broadcast around the world on radio and television that day. So if you put together those public reports with a shot to the back and to the back of the head affirmed by the Warren Commission of 1964, then you get at least 4 hits to JFK, which is as simple as 2 + 2 = 4. And it becomes obvious because the authorities don't want you to solve a crime that they did not solve for the equally obvious reason that they were complicit. So in relation to the assassination of JFK, the CIA authored a memorandum on how to discredit serious students of JFK by suggesting that they had nothing new to offer, that they were benefiting financially and more, without addressing the evidence they uncovered, which has remained the case to this day. They were targeting men like Mark Lane, who challenged the magic bullet theory, and many others, focusing on those doing the research to put an end to research. David W. Manick, MD, PhD, the leading expert on the medical evidence in the case of JFK today, performed a simple experiment by plotting the official trajectory of the bullet that officials claim passed through JFK's neck and entered Texas Governor John Connolly's back, and discovered that it is anatomically impossible because cervical vertebrae intervene. When the bad guys control the evidence, they can manipulate, fabricate, and prevaricate to their heart's content. In this case, for example, the home movies of the assassination, especially the Zapruder film, had to be fixed to conceal the blowout at the back of the head. So they blacked it out in early frames, but overlooked that it might be visible in later, such as 374 and 375. David Manick conducted meticulous studies using a technique from physics known as optical densitometry to determine the relative density of objects whose exposure to radiation created the images on the X-ray, and found that they had been patched. But whereas Area P bore a striking resemblance to the blowout visible in those later frames, where the pink extension was a skull flap blown open by the use of a frangible or exploding bullet, but where the correspondence is striking, save for part of the wound covered by hair. These are objective scientific investigations based on observation, measurement, and experiment. And they demonstrate that once you separate the fake evidence from the real, cases like these are not especially difficult to solve. Check out, for example, JFK, who is responsible and why. So how can it be the case that more than 50 years after the fact, the mainstream media leaves us in the dark and still insists that JFK was killed by a lone, demented gunman who cannot possibly have been in two places at the same time to fire shots from both behind and from in front? Indeed, we have established that Lee Oswald was standing in the doorway when the JFK motorcade passed by, which means that he not only cannot have been the lone gunman, but cannot have been one of the shooters, where I have identified 6 by name, rank, and serial number, and only Damagard is 7th, where there now appear to have been even an 8th on the South Knoll, whose identity remains unknown as of this time. Since we have only limited resources, but the government has vast, the government can only have failed to establish the truth because the government wanted to conceal it. We have been played for suckers and sacks. We hear a lot about following the science, especially in relation to the coronavirus phenomenon, but when we file real science, the empirically based data-driven science, as opposed to what passes for science in the mainstream media, we discover there's been no increase in deaths in any age group during 2020, which would be preposterous if we were really undergoing a pandemic. Less direct evidence also substantiates that if the hospitals were overflowing with patients with upper respiratory diseases, then there would be a surge in the use of oxygen in IV bags and stands. But that is not the case, which proves directly in the case of no age group variance, indirectly in relation to the purchase of medical equipment required, that we are being played by a humongous medical political deception. And when the social media giants act in coordination with the deep state by censoring and suppressing discussion of issues of immense importance to America, such as whether or not the CV pandemic is real, whether or not the 2020 election was stolen, and whether or not mask wearing is killing us slowly, we have seriously lost our way in our ability to learn the truth. Our future and our lives are at stake. We must therefore understand that those who are suppressing freedom of speech and freedom of the press, where Amazon.com has banned 6 of my books about Sandy Hook, the Boston bombing, Orlando and Dallas, Charlottesville, Parkland, and even the moon landing, it's not because I and my collaborators got it wrong, but because we got it right. But Amazon.com is not alone in disgracing itself by suppressing research exposing these events as crimes involving fraud and theft by deception, not just involving millions, but billions in the case of the Apollo moon mission deception, but then resorting to the courts of social media and even acts of Congress to silence and suppress those who are seeking to expose them. The treatment of Marjorie Taylor Greene is one especially glaring example. The attempt to punish Senator Josh Hawley is another. We know there was no incitement by President Trump nor any effort to overthrow the government of the United States. Yet the Democrats are trying to impeach him for the second time when he is no longer in office. There are reasons for these bizarre events, and they have everything to do with those who are attempting to stop them. Carl, your thoughts?
Well, as a national board certified teacher of U.S. history, I fully recommend Dr. Fetzer's work as the best that I have found to be able to have an analysis of all of the facts that would be relevant. The idea of the New York Times promoting a truth star or whatever it is that they called it is exactly to stop people from asking these questions of the deep state. The United States has been a rogue state empire. And that is the best way that I can academically call it regarding the assassination of President Kennedy. I also recommend the work of retired advanced placement U.S. history teacher John Hankey in his documentary called Dark Legacy, where he shows the acting press secretary Kidroff answering the question in the press conference. And he says to the reporter, it's a simple matter of a bullet right through the head. And he points exactly where he was shown of what happened. And these people, the emergency room testimony by those expert witnesses was omitted from the Warren Commission report. And they decided that they would only have the autopsy, which they hired a medical doctor who had never performed an autopsy by gunshot in order to do the most important one in history for President Kennedy. And he was ordered and agreed not to examine the wound from the back. And that would be critical because the bullet was probably still in there as part of the testimony of the emergency room personnel. When Kennedy came in, he was still breathing and they could hear the right lung filled with fluid, which means that that would be a low velocity bullet that had entered into the lung and was still in there. And for Dr. Mantic with that patch, that ridiculous patch, if you do a density analysis with the color that should be emitted from an X-ray, that bright white would indicate that the bone density was approximately the entire, he was literally a bonehead. So if we take the magnitude figure of there are perhaps 100 such glaring facts that prove that the official story is a complete lie, a ridiculous lie. I like how Chris said it, to how did you say, Chris?
Infantilize.
Yeah, there you go. That's exactly what's going on.
Seems like it.
Yeah,
Yeah, it sounds like an argument in the back seat with middle schoolers, you know?
Yeah, they had to get the body under military control so they could control the conduct of the autopsy. And you're correct that they did not dissect the neck, which they really ought to have done, and which Dr. Bob Livingston, World Authority on the Human Brain, had recommended to Dr. Humes earlier that day. Chris, your thoughts?
Yeah, I think that, you got to look at the people involved, the places, the situation. They always run the same formula where they run the venue, and even like say the medical facility like Bethesda is notorious for cover-ups and serious shenanigans. So that doesn't surprise me at all what's going on with that. They also use like scene managers and recycled names like Parkland Hospital or Parkland down in Florida, the school shooting. Posner would be a one with Sandy Hook, and that butt clown Gerald Posner trying to say Lee Oswald acted alone. I don't know if you ever heard that guy or not, but what a joke. I think that the intelligence agencies often put these guys out to write these bullshit books out there so that they steer the herd and muck the waters, and send them into cul-de-sacs in terms of finding truth. So I think that, you see these scene managers come in and do a lot of the stuff, these stringers from the intelligence agencies many times. In the case of that Posner guy, the Gerald Posner, he also explained the 2008 crash as like he blamed it on the victims, the borrowers, and not the lenders, and certainly ignored much of the misdeeds of the financial institutions in his books, just like he did with much of the stuff that you presented in yours, and good on you for standing up for those things. Because these people are here to really tell the innocent that there's nothing to see here and have them move along, and to make us or anybody that's really fighting for the truth look like, lunatics or conspiracy theorists. And that's a big part of the mainstream media, and the full assist on that. They are like accomplices in gaslighting us in standing up for these things. So they're really going after those two that you said, Holly and Taylor Greene. And Americans really have to stand together, not only for those people, but also to a certain extent, Trump, if he is in fact legit and he is going through this thing and it's not a theater, at some point in time, common sense and the right thing have to become a factor. Some ethics or democracy or justice have to become prominent concerns for most people. And I think they are. I just think that right now they're so, people are just so confused and just pulled in different directions and under duress, whether it's, emotionally, economically, socially, whatever, politically. So I don't think it's an accident that this environment of fear is let's just say propelling itself is forward in the way that it is. I think that they are trying to manufacture this on both sides and force people into picking a side on this, and really, whether you're anti-vax or anti-mask or any of these things, that's the point. They're trying to put a pro and a con and put people into this polarization. So Americans are going to have to come together outside of the party lines at some point in time, You know, I mean, I'm looking at, say, some of the people that are being mobilized by this big money interest from the DNC side. And there are a bunch of poor folks that don't know better. And they're being mobilized against a bunch of maybe middle-class folks or, you know, whatever that maybe know better, that are certainly diametrically opposed to each other by this controlled opposition offering. So I think that, you know, at some point in time, we're going to have to come out of the CFR APAC mainstream media paradigm and forge another alternative.
Wow, that was terrific. Meanwhile, we have a question of whether AOC really was in fear of the loss of her life. She's been challenged by a Republican representative, Nancy Mace, whose office is just 2 doors down. She tweeted, AOC made clear she didn't know who was at her door. Breathless attempts by media to fan fictitious news flames are dangerous. My office is 2 doors down. Insurrectionists never stormed our hallway. Egregious doesn't even begin to cover it. Is there nothing the MSM won't publicize? Newsweek had a story about her beating on her door, calling out where she is, where are you, where are you, rushing to her bathroom to protect herself. Sebastian Gorka has called her out. She lied about where she grew up. She lied about where she was on January 6th. She lied about being in danger. AOC will lie about anything. Meanwhile, AOC just pulled a Jesse Smollett. AOC was not in the Capitol building during her near-death experience. She claims to have been in her office, which is located in the Cannon building. Rioters did not breach the Cannon building. AOC's account stands in sharp contrast to Mace's. This is what she's saying. Rioters actually entered her office, forcing her to take refuge inside her bathroom. So I ran back into my office. I opened it. There's a closet in the bathroom. I jumped in my bathroom. This is AOC claiming this happened. I was hiding behind the doors and I heard these yells of, where is she? As members of the mob banged against the door. She said, this was the moment I thought everything was over. And the weird thing about moments like these is you lose all sense of time. In retrospect, maybe it was 4 seconds, maybe 5, maybe 10, maybe just 1, I don't know. It felt like my brain was able to have so many thoughts. In between the screams and the yells, she added, I thought I was going to die. But it was all total bullshit. She was nowhere near the trespassers. She was in the Cannon building, quite away from the rotunda and the House chamber. You seriously cannot believe one word that comes out of Sandy Cortez's mouth. She has a history of playing fast and loose with facts and the truth. Candace Owens, for example, has tweeted, on a day in which Alexandria Ocasio-Smollett is trending, please never forget the time that AOC staged a photo shoot dressed all in white at a parking lot to spread lies about immigrant children in cages. Faking her own attempted murder was the next logical step. And yet she herself doubled down. She said this is the latest manipulative take on the right. They're manipulating the fact most people don't know the layout of the Capitol complex. We are all on the Capitol complex. The attack wasn't just on the dome. The bombs Trump supporters planted surrounded our offices too. Meanwhile, people are trying to rush and infiltrate. I mean, this is embarrassingly bad, digging a deeper and deeper hole. Yesterday, AOC did a video in which she disclosed she's a survivor of sexual assault and has had trauma. She explained, some people are telling her to just move on, which makes them like every other abuser who tells you to just move on. But Carl, can we believe anything she says, including about this alleged sexual abuse? Your thoughts?
Well, see, if we had an actual honest criminal investigation, because that's serious charges, she's saying that people entered into the building with vocabulary and actions that one would take as that is a crime of threatening physical damage. Hey, you know what? I think that there probably would be a security camera or two that you could check the footage of what's going on in the hall and the offices. What do you think? And then you have this other guy, Mr. Bonilla Chavez. I think that you got to talk to him and get him on the record. And if you can prove that he's lying from the security video, then, you know, he would be implicated and put into jail too. Maybe he would choose his own protection rather than to promote that proven liar who, as you demonstrated, put on a show for caged children, which is a serious topic, but she lied about that. So again, it seems like all they have is just this blustery testimony that is proven BS without facts to support it. And I would just love to have the security camera footage shown to her and then says, any comments you would like to make on this or any revisions of perhaps a faulty memory?
Great point, Carl. I'm sorry she has just totally discredited herself forever. Chris, your thoughts?
Well, I think that most Americans don't have the attention spans or even the diligence or the patience to really get through the due process that would be required to go through, like Carl's saying, putting these witnesses on stand and deposing them in the court of law. So I think really the sad thing is people just take the low-hanging fruit from the mainstream media and from the politician who are most likely proven liars, all of them. But in the case of her, she's bearing false witness and crying wolf. And in many instances, inverting many situations, social crutches, we'll say, where she is exploiting or pandering to a demographic or herself. I've never seen such a narcissistic person in my life. You know, if you ever listen to her talk, me, I, me, I. You know, so I mean, like, you can really tell a lot about a person by the way they talk and what they say and what they're really focused on. And in most cases, she uses these events to aggrandize herself and her political career. So she reminds me kind of like of David Hogg, you know, where she's not even in the building and she's talking about how threatened it was and how crazy things were. And, you know, this is like I say, pretty bad news. So I think that it does need to get punished or need to get called out. So these guys have never really let the truth get in the way of a good story. And you should understand that they will do anything to achieve their objectives. And the truth is irrelevant. And inversions seem to be the goal of these people. So there's a lot of serial pandering that goes on and demographics that maybe infiltrate the party on each side under different pretenses. I like to call them trifectas, like a Rachel Dolezal, you know, a Black Jewish woman, or, you know, something like that, where they have a triple play in terms of a demographic or a partisan demographic they're trying to appeal to, let's just say. So I think that, yeah, as far as AOC goes, she's probably raised in some sort of think tank or some sort of petri dish for this type of very purpose. And I don't know if you remember that picture of Huma Abedin's sister, Heba Abedin. I still can't get over the shocking resemblance between those two. And I have to wonder what the hell is going on with our political spectrum and these actors that are filling it.
Well, you're both making such extraordinarily good points. I love it. Meanwhile, Democrats filed the first of many anti-rights bills directed at gun owners. This is shocking. Texas Representative totally expected, however. Sheila Jackson Lee filed two gun control bills, House Resolution 125 and 127. 127 requires the registration of all firearms and ammunition, bans 50 caliber ammunition, requires a mental health exam for you, your spouse, and your family, requires a government license the mental health professionals who can perform the exams, bans all ammunition magazines holding more than 10 rounds, establishes a national ammunition registry, a national firearms registry, mandates gun owners purchase civil liability insurance, taxes gun owners $800 a year. Her Bill 125 calls for a 7-day waiting period before taking possession of a semi-automatic, firearm, muffler, ammo, or magazine, outlaws person-to-person transfers. Now, it gets really bizarre as she lists her justification. She claims there's nearly one mass shooting per day in the U.S., 355 mass shootings since 2017. Since December 2012, there have been at least 1,518 mass shootings, with at least 1,715 people killed, 6,089 wounded. To reach those numbers, you have to call the nightly carnage in Chicago and Baltimore mass shootings. Each day, 92 Americans are victims of gun violence, resulting in more than 33,000 deaths annually. We're supposed to ignore that most of these are suicides and victims of drug gangs in our Democrat-controlled cities. There have been 0 mass shootings stopped by armed civilians in the past 33 years. This is a press release rather than a factual document. It's against the law for us to lie during sworn congressional testimony, but it appears Congresswomen can present falsehoods as facts with impunity. Let me refresh your memory. Almost all of our mass murders when gun-free zones were honest citizens were disarmed. The FBI's own numbers show there were at least 8 mass murders stopped by civilians. I've counted over a dozen. Here are a few. Stephen Williford, who lived next door to a church in Texas, stopped mass murder with his AR-15. Jack Wilson, part of a church security team, stopped a murder at his church. An armed citizen stopped a mass murder at California synagogue. We know the number of people murdered when an armed civilian present is fewer than 3. That number soars to about 15 when we wait for the police to arrive. Time is the enemy, not your honest neighbor next door who owns a gun. Distracting ourselves with Lee's outrageous lies, however, misses the crucial point that honest U.S. citizens defend themselves by the thousands every day. Our best estimate is that honest gun owners use a firearm to prevent a murder or violent crime over 1 million times each year. If it were you saving your family at night, then each event might save several lives. That estimate includes tens of thousands of sexual assaults that never became rapes. When we disarm the good guys and gals, millions of our neighbors become victims of violent crimes. Disarm her and grandma doesn't chase away a home invasion robber. Instead, he beats grandma. The co-eds don't stop the sexual assault by an intruder in their dorm. Instead, they are raped and beaten. That's what Representative Lee wants. Democrats need violence to justify a police state. This isn't progressing toward greater human rights and freedom. This is a return to feudal barbarism with a strong rule of the weak and ordinary citizens are disarmed. Back then, only the rulers and their henchmen were allowed to own weapons and bear arms for their protection, not ours. That is what we see from politicians today. We don't have government agents protecting us. We don't hire teams of armed security until help arrives. It's up to us to protect the people we love. Carl, your thoughts?
Wow. I'm wondering as we're looking at this, is this just me or these events tend to be more and more intense, more and more polarized, which in political theory is a good thing because the greater the polarization, the more of the indication that you're going to get a resolution to that. So HR 127, asking everyone to declare if they have a gun or not. 50 million American households will refuse to do that because that registration list is where they create a confiscation list. So if she's complaining about people being killed by arms, well, how about the US military with having, since World War II, all these interventions which are illegal, lie-started wars of aggression that have killed about 30 million, or if you put that on an average of per year, about 1/3 of a million per year. These are war crimes. If you want to go crimes against humanity, the US government is the leading nation to allow policy of intentional damning, crushing debt in what is called the developing world, which is really just the colonial victims and neo-colonialism. And that is about 10 million every year. And if you just count up the total number of people killed by intentional poverty since the Clintons were in office, that number is about 500 million now. 500 million, when we, as a math teacher as well, when we get into these big numbers, it's hard to imagine the carnage. So the 500 million killed by intentional poverty since the Clintons have been in the White House is more deaths than all of the wars, all of the murders, all of the violence in all recorded human history. So what we're seeing is the totalitarian leaders, this one-party statism, they are projecting what they do onto, as Chris said earlier, they're blaming the victims, and that is all that they ever do. And finally, back to the history teacher side of me after the math side, the American Revolution 1.0 began when our own government came after the guns in Lexington and Concord. And ladies and gentlemen, if you want to make the argument, yeah, they didn't have assault, right? No, they had cannon, okay? Cannon. The point of the Second Amendment is so that the firepower of the people exceeds that of the government to keep the people safe from the government based upon the experience of the government taking away the rights of the people.
Yes, very nice point. And they seem to ignore the language of the Second Amendment, which is so crystal clear that the right of the people to keep and bear arms shall not be infringed. Chris, your thoughts?
Yeah, I agree with Carl and his sentiments there. I would also maybe add something a little bit more to this possibly and say that these systematic frustrations of justice or these intentional and theatric political poop fights, I think are intentional to radicalize the bases from each side and even the onlookers that won't even or haven't traditionally picked a side or have a dog in the political fight, so to speak. So people that are maybe not Trump candidates or base in the Trump base would find themselves supporting Trump because he's standing for the positions that are being ascribed to him in opposition to the lunacy of the Democrats. So I think that really the Democrats are hemorrhaging not only credibility, but any sort of political power that they'd like to hold on to. And the tighter they seem to squeeze, the more that's slipping through their fingers. So I think that this is really some bad stuff that they're doing. That Congresswoman Lee or whatever that put out that fact list, or whatever you call that thing, that seems to me like a wink and a nod. If you look at the numbers and the stats that she's pulling out of her ass, this is like some Masonic stuff. And I think that that's a big part of it too, where, you know, the people that know what's going on are triggered by this type of stuff and calling bullshit. And the people that have no clue are going, oh my God, look at the 33 million, 33 years, you know, and like that emotion or fear, you know, it doesn't matter if it's from the basis of someone, you know, accelerating it because they're full of shit. You know, it's like these facts are irrelevant. These people use emotion in the face of evidence. And really, at some point in time, are they going to provide any sort of evidence to back the claims that they're making? And in terms of, I mean, they seem to be some pretty outrageous claims that have no evidence. They never get held to account for these things. So like at some point in time, are people going to demand them to really provide the evidence that provides this basis for these claims? Or at some point in time, are they going to rule these claims irrelevant because, you know, obviously these people are just known liars, thieves, or at least trying to hoodwink people. So, yeah, I think that you got to look at the money behind this. I think the central banks and the intelligence agencies and the FBI and these NGOs, the Antifa, BLM, and Proud Boys, are, you know, all these things are part of an apparatus in this domestic operation. And I think that if there's ever been a reason to use things like the NSA or the National Security Acts or any of the reasons that they put these measures in, what better reason than now? If you're not going to look after the elderly, the young, the fighting age male population, the women, the children, you name it, the entire sense of democracy or reasonable wages or anything like this, if you're not going to protect this in terms of national security, I don't know what you're doing in terms of these things. And I don't know why people are continuing to pay for these things with their tax dollars, if in fact they're only going to be used asymmetrically against the people.
Very nice. Very nice. Dems are calling this sedition, where Missouri subverts the Biden gun laws and nullifying federal statutes, a very appropriate move. The measure would nullify federal laws or other action deemed to infringe on a person's Second Amendment right to bear arms. All Missouri gun laws would persist in effect under the bill, one step away from approval by the chamber and transfer to the Senate, where a comparable Second Amendment Preservation Act awaits a first floor hearing. I really like what they're doing here, showing that the states can actually take measures that are going to protect the people from this infringement by the monsters who are running the government. Let me throw in here a very odd, bizarre blog from the Pentagon warning that freedom leads to populism, which undermines national security. How ridiculous is this? They're talking about really further constraints on First Amendment by way of a ministry of truth, which, notice, if freedom leads to populism, which is really political participation in politics, in other words, democracy, how can that possibly undermine national security? It's embarrassed that this even appeared in print for the Pentagon's Defense One blog by Divya Ramji and Elsa B. Kenya. I think it's as ridiculous as anything I've ever seen. No matter what anti-free speech measure they try to impose, the tech giants always seem to come up short in terms of the Pentagon. New rules must be introduced for algorithms to determine what users see and for the data collect for themselves. It's embarrassingly bad. The Pentagon wants to see Congress pass robust legislation to oversee how data is aggregated. The AI algorithm need to be specifically programmed, it says, to ensure that all users are receiving the same propaganda at the same time, producing uniformity in belief. They also want Congress to tackle issues of far-right extremism and white supremacist violence that have become global threats. No mention is made, however, about Black or other racial groups' activity or Antifa in the streets. This is just rubbish. Meanwhile, just to toss it in, we have Michael Flynn actually talking not only about there not being a plan, but at the end, or not having signed the Insurrection Act, which I think is false. But listen to what he has to say here at the end of this conversation, which is the most interesting of it.
Name is Stan, that Trump would win the presidency.
He made a wager.
Bottle of wine. I guess I need to pay up that bet because President Biden is there, isn't he? He is the one, and we have to come to grips with that. We want to hear it from you, General Flynn.
It depends on define. Yeah, well, I mean, here we are. I'd say hold that bottle of wine. Hold on to that bottle of wine. I would not concede that bottle of wine. That's Mike Flynn.
Okay.
I would not concede that bottle of wine. But I'll leave it at that.
I find that very encouraging that it'll not concede the bottle of wine. Meanwhile, we have evidence that Israelis are using placebo COVID vaccines and have changed the PCR test to prove vaccines are working. According to a new study in Israel, an astonishingly low number, 0.06% of those who have received the second round of the Pfizer COVID vaccine reported sick, and none of them seriously. Carl, this is just a stunning report here. It appears to be totally fabricated. If we are to believe the Israeli experts, the Pfizer vaccine is miraculously stopping people from actually becoming infected or testing positive at all, which is in complete defiance of vaccine science. But when it comes to this pandemic, there seem to be a lot of miracles happening in Israel, like the complete disappearance of the seasonal flu. There's absolutely nothing about the Pfizer vaccine that would stop people from testing positive for COVID. 99.9% of those who test positive, by the way, are asymptomatic. And a recent study in China with 10 million subjects proved there is zero transmission of COVID in asymptomatic people. So the only way for vaccinating Israelis to no longer test positive for COVID is for the health ministry to have lowered cycling threshold for the PCR test from 35 or 40 to under 25, which is exactly what the World Health Organization recommended 2 weeks ago. Oddly enough, these fake successful results in Israel will be used to convince hundreds of millions of Gentiles in the West that these dangerous, even deadly vaccines are safe and effective, and many people will become disabled and die after they take hot doses of the real vaccines. That seems to be the real story. Carl, your thoughts?
Yeah, with the first story with the Missouri with supporting the Second Amendment, is that, yeah, and as you said, Jim, the language is absolutely crystal clear, but these criminals have wheedled away at that with just BS reasons, just excuses, just saying whatever their talking points seem to work well with control groups, to use that as rhetoric to destroy the Constitution, to destroy the American experiment. And people really do need to pick a side. If they're going to stand to defend the Constitution of the United States against all enemies, foreign and domestic. And as I said, at the beginning of the Constitution, Benjamin Franklin, in his closing comments, he predicted that the American public could not defend the Constitution and that it would only last a generation or two because the general public were unable to do anything other than be dictated to. With the, people with the story of Star Wars, George Lucas admitted that he wrote that story that the evil empire is the United States. And this was Lucas creating a story as an anti-Vietnam War protest. He flat out said, the evil empire is the United States. And I imagine that if you looked into further with that story, that the propaganda of the empire is that they just want to keep people safe. Now that the PCR test, reducing the number of cycles that those go through, I'm not an expert in that, but the people who are experts, the best analogy that I heard from one is that if you run that cycle 45 times, you're going to catch everything. So this would be similar to somebody claiming that inside your house, you are operating a farm with thousands of geese, when the actual truth is that you have one pillow with goose feathers in it.
Nice. Chris, your thoughts?
That's an interesting analogy. Yeah, it is pretty wild stuff. How that medical witch hunt has been allowed to be the yardstick or the metric for this diagnosis and these protocols and the bizarre inversions of medical procedures that have been inverted. I think that really is a war on perception and perception management. And it really has to do with trying to eliminate the notion of popular sovereignty amongst the people. The ruling class has always tried to do this, like Carl said, going back to the Van Buren administration and arguably since maybe even before that in instances that maybe I'm not aware of. But I think that all presidents have really made this type of decision and even congressmen to serve the 1% and to really to feed the people some sort of inversion or perception management in terms of populism that's really in most cases not the deliverance of what the people want, but just a way to get people going back and forth into this tug of war. I think that's a big part. When I say theater, very real people are going through some very real troubles and suffering immensely. And this is the duress that makes this emotional reaction the byproduct and makes this whole situation possible, where people don't see the forest through the trees and the fits of emotion and in the fits of duress. So I think that these things are created by think tanks and funded by things like Wall Street and these robber barons. And if you even look at things like FANGs in the mainstream media, a lot of these things were developed by taxpayer dollars and our divisions of military operations or things that were DARPA developments. And they're creating these divergent realities in accordance to the political spectrum that is desired for the people to choose from. So I'm watching this thing go on like this, and I'm kind of hoping that humanity can see through this as well as I've been able to see through it, hopefully, and really start to pick up from down and like Carl says, pick a side and pick the right side, because that will be important. And I have to say about this technology that's going on with these vaccines and the nanotech and things like that, this whole pandemic hoax is arguably a construct from the World Economic Forum and the robber barons and the bankers of the world, a mass eugenics program where they're trying to create the justification to introduce this nanotech into our bodies. And of course, from there, could probably control the intellectual property and actual custody of humans from this type of legal endeavor. If you follow their models that they use with the Monsanto blueprint and how they did that with farmers that were cross-pollinated with Monsanto product. So these patent lawyers are pretty devious, and the people putting this stuff together are pretty sinister as well. And I'd also like to point out that Israel has also backdoored most of our technology for the sake of controlling these type of situations. So they would backdoor these biosecurity weapons, just like they have with economic securities and just like they probably have with our political structure as well. I would guess that crypto is a big push for this type of total control, social contact tracing, monitoring, quantum analysis of real-time inventory of the tax cattle. So this is like big data, literally trying to put the grip on labor and the population of the world and put some sort of of control on them. In this age of information is power, and really people they don't understand the power they're just rendering over to these data merchants, and really the amount of money that's involved with this type of information and this data transfer. So truly some amazing stuff, an unparalleled situation in terms of human history. And like I say, this is a despot's wet dream to have this type of technocracy to perfect the slave system in such a manner. And I think that's what they've been trying to do all along.
Fascinating. Fascinating. Well, here we have the National Security Council seeming to pivot against Iran. I think they were looking forward to the Biden administration wanting to renew the Iran deal, but where they're now saying that Iran has to stop its enrichment of uranium, whereas Iran is insisting that they must relieve the sanctions, which are, after all, violations of international law as forms of collective punishment. They're proscribed by both the Geneva Conventions and the UN Charter. Iran denies it's seeking to develop nuclear weapons. But here you have Israel's top military official warning the US to not rejoin the Iran nuclear deal. I'm convinced that the Israelis supported Biden over Trump because they knew Trump would not bomb Iran. And they're hoping they can manipulate the Biden administration into taking precisely that action. Let's have some concise comments about this from you, Carl, first, and then Chris.
Well, again, this is all projection of the liars blaming the victim, with Iran being the victim of 1953 Operation Ajax to overthrow their democracy. And the central complaint that caused the overthrow of Iran's democracy was they wanted more than the 10% of their oil profits that they were getting. And in terms of nuclear fear, well, okay, let's go back to Saddam. And one of the reasons to justify war against Saddam and Iraq was the claim that they were refining nuclear material, that they had imported tubes that could only be used for the refinement of nuclear material. And then when you ask the best experts in the world at the IAEA and the US Department of Energy, well, how about that? Is that true? Both of them said, well, actually, those tubes cannot be used for the process as centrifuges. It's the wrong size. It's the material would make it impossible. If you actually wanted them to fail at refining nuclear material up to the degree necessary for a weapon, you should give them those tubes because they won't work. So back to the major theme that I have, until Americans demand the arrests of these psychopaths attempting to foment war, which is, again, another charge of treason, because you're sending Americans into foreign lands where they're going to be the legitimate targets of patriots.
Nice. Chris, your thoughts?
Yeah, I'd like to point out that Israel is probably the largest terror organization or nation in my recollection of recent history, as far as their development and their prosperity has always come from undermining other nations from within, economically or politically, to aggrandize their own economic opportunities and accumulate assets. And Israel has always been the goal of all these traitors and all these multinational infiltrators around the world in these intelligence agencies and these national banks. So, you can look at the political differences or the ideological or religious differences of these robber barons and these billionaires in the Fortune 500. But the thing they always have in common is London and Israel, and working towards that and the UN goals. So I think it's important to point that out. One lies, the other swears to it. They got a long history of that. And think about weapons of mass destruction or things they did after 9/11 with the war of terror, extraordinary renditions, black sites, things like this, waterboarding innocent people for 20 years. And then after they get called out on the bullshit and find out that they're the intelligence agencies behind ISIS and Al Qaeda and all these things like this, then what do? They flip and transition to this pandemic, and then they run this gambit on us. So I'm really kind of getting a little sick of these guys, and I think the rest of the world probably is too. And if Israel's truly interested in disarming anybody, I think they should disarm themselves first. Israel first, like it always is, and they should lead by that example, because they're arguably the most erratic and the most unstable nation on earth in terms of political dissent and dealing with that. You're not even allowed to criticize these people without being blasted into the Samson option, right?
Nice, very nice. I love One lies and the other swears to it. Meanwhile, we want to hear from you. Fan mail, pro or con, send to live-need-to-know@gmail.com. Live-need-to-know@gmail.com. We have a wonderful summary by Carl about the military in charge. Chess games devoted to fewer and fewer possible moves. Both sides are almost out of moves. Stock market may crash next week from insider trading, tricks, and fraud. That the military is in total control, allowing the deep state and Democrats to flounder in their own lies. The purpose? To maximize enemy destruction and protect Americans from violence. The cover story? Determine election fraud facts to transfer back to civilian power. The corporate media will fail or fall because they allow Biden to play president in Culver City at a California studio, refusing to report on the U.S. military, informing the corporate media that most of the government is currently under arrest for election fraud and the COVID hoax to crash our economy and attack our people. Biden and the deep state are just buying time to find an escape. They have no power. 2020 election fraud will not stand. The vote for fraud for Trump was 4-1 in his favor. It turns out that these executive orders are not effective for 30 days, so it's going to be a while. Most interestingly, whether in Culver City or not, the corner wall is coming apart. They're clearly on a soundstage, and there you have not only the fake Joe Biden, but Nancy Pelosi to boot. I think someone wanted to expose the charade. Meanwhile, Trump is publishing on Gab. Interestingly, someone noted in his resignation from the Screen Actors Guild, he signed his name as President Donald J. Trump. I would add a correction. It turns out not only was I wrong that there are nameplates on all of the offices in the Congress, but they are very handsome nameplates as well. Meanwhile, let me have our final thoughts. Carl, yours.
Well, that excerpt of that roundtable discussion kind of summarizes what I see, and that the main question for our viewers is that who is really in charge? If we have white hats in charge, then this is all just strategy based upon on the ground evolution of action, and all of the facts are on the side of saving the republic, supporting the Constitution, and it's just a matter of how they want to play those cards. It might be that the military, I heard other testimony from Simon Parks saying that the military, for the history books, they want the courts to take the first move, which might be through the Supreme Court agreeing to hear cases. It might be through the impeachment trial that must hear that evidence. I don't know. But in the worst case scenario, if this is just another example of the black hats just handing our backsides to us and mocking us, then, Juan O'Savin, who his stuff resonates with me, he said by April 1st is when he made his bets about Donald Trump being president of the United States. But if by March 4th, when the original Constitution would put Trump back in office as the 19th president of the United States, if nothing has shown up by then I got to put on my Gandhi hat and go Dr. King and start taking the actions that I can see that I can do, because my patients will be out at that point.
Chris, your final thoughts.
Yeah, I have to maybe share a little more skepticism in this as far as the white hats and the long-term operation. I think we've seen a lot of stuff for this to really be, I guess, to go on this long, we'll just say. And I would just like to say that, most Americans should prepare as if this is not going to be the case and that Biden is in control. Because if Trump does get in and then supposedly this does work out, as you guys are saying, then we can be pleasantly surprised rather than utterly disappointed, but certainly prepared for the situation if it doesn't materialize as you hope. So I think that really citizens should really demand of each other and of ourselves the responsibility that's required to uphold this freedom and to really to take back what we've always sacrificed for convenience, and to really look at things like maybe going outside the conventional systems of control, like using barter or silver or gold, or putting some sort of an exchange system amongst ourselves beyond the scope of this Leviathan business model that seems to be used to fund this type of oppression against its own citizens. So I think that really, if Trump does get through and does sort this out and does handle business like you guys are hoping for, that would be a fantastic thing. But to tell people to put their hope on that and to reasonably anticipate that without any sort of evidence to provide this beyond what we're seeing here, I think that maybe it's a far stretch for some people, and maybe they are more skeptical of this. And I think that everyone, whether you believe it or not, should prepare like it's not going to happen. And if it does, then like I say, you'll be happy instead of deflated. And I think that's pretty funny how that West Wing set got blown out like that. Somebody like must have bumped it with a forklift. Pretty wild stuff, man. It doesn't shock me. It's almost like they have to show part of this too, I think, just to get the critical mass going crazy and to get the mass hysteria from the ignorant masses that are going, what are you so worried about? That's bullshit. It's and it's part of the show, I think, to really work people up and work the rabble up, because everybody fills in the blanks of the unknown with their imagination and with their hopes and with their fears sometimes. And I just I don't want anybody to be blindsided by these things without my ability to see sufficient enough evidence to say this is going to happen. But I'm not on the inside. I'm not an intelligence person. I don't have military connections. I'm not anything like that. So you guys might know something that I don't, and if that's the case, more power to you, and I hope you're right.
Well, this is Jim Fetzer in Madison, Wisconsin, thanking Carl Herman in San Ramon, California, and Chris Weinert in Detroit, Michigan, for really the brilliance of their commentary. I think Carl's got it right. If something doesn't happen by the 4th of March, I'm going to be highly disillusioned. I believe they're going to play out this impeachment trial to backfire on the Democrats massively. I can't see any way it's going to benefit the Democrats, only Trump. I would like to use it to give massive proof of election fraud, but one way or another, this needs to be brought to a head and resolved. And if it hasn't happened by the 4th of March, I think we're going to have to lock and load. Thank you for joining us today. We'll be back tomorrow with more of the news you need.